And thank you for your kind presentation and for having accepted our paper. Its title refers to our working hypothesis with which we first began our research. That is, that the Greek myths found in Christian universal chronicles are drawn from, or so to speak, flow from the apologetic tradition. We set out to test such hypotheses by following certain streams of myths that we have identified between apologetics and chronography, while observing the processes of transmission of these contents and their adaptation to the context in which they are inserted from time to time. We will begin by briefly presenting the Christian Universal Chronicle and its relationship with apologetic literature, as well as the texts we have considered. Then we will illustrate the genesis of our working hypothesis and a first phase of the verification to which we have subjected it. We will conclude with some remarks on the data that we have collected and with new questions that inevitably emerge from the research. We can begin with the Universal Chronicle. Christian Universal Chronicles are historiographical works whose intention is to set out the whole of the human history from its origin to the time of writing, taking biblical history as a chronological framework. The universal perspective also applies to the spatial dimension. These works therefore seek to embrace, at least ideally, the history of all peoples. Such histories are not only displayed in parallel, but they are related through synchronisms. For instance, it is pointed out that while a certain king ruled over the Assyrians, a certain pharaoh was reigning over Egypt, or that at the time of such pharaoh, a certain philosopher flourished in Greece. Another feature of these works is worth emphasizing for the theme we are dealing with, namely that the earliest phases of the human history are covered by myths, as far as the Greek world is concerned. The inclusion of myth in history is not a novelty introduced by Christian chronicles. Already in the Hellenistic period, the Greek historians, starting with Hephaestus, had used myth to cover the period before the Trojan War or the First Olympiad, in an attempt to demonstrate the antiquity of Greek civilization in comparison with the cultures of the Near East and Egypt, whose stories dated back to very ancient times. These are the characteristics of this genre, which are essential to understand the analysis we are going to make. Now we can present in two words the chronicles we will consider. Eusebius of Caesarea's canons, of the synoptic tables contained in the canons, in addition to an Armenian version and some Greek fragments, we possess the Latin translation by Jerome. The period covered by the Greek versions goes from Abram to 325. The Excelsa Latina Barbari, a Latin version produced between the 6th and the 7th centuries in Merovingian Gaul of an Alexandrian Greek chronicle from Adam to the Emperor Anastasius, usually dated to the 5th century. And the Chronicle of John Malalas, a 6th century chronicle covering the period from Adam to Justinian. This is the first work of this genre that has come down to us in a non-fragmentary, though epitomized form, and its author is probably linked to the Syriac metropolis of Antioch. We are aware that an important role in the transition from apologetics to chronicle is played by the chronography of Sesto Julius Africanus, the first known Christian universal chronicle, composed in the 3rd century. However, the fact that this text has come down to us only in fragments makes it difficult to make a comparison with it, leading to reliable conclusions. Although the depths of the universal chronicle to apologetics are certainly more numerous and extensive, we will highlight only one specific issue here, which will, however, suffice for our purpose. One of the claims that apologetic literature makes in defense of the Christian religion is that Jewish wisdom, seen as the precursor of Christianity, is more ancient than pagan and particularly Greek wisdom. To prove this assumption, apologists engage in sometimes complex chronological demonstrations. aimed at proving the priority of Jewish cultural figures over their pagan counterparts. The main and most debated case is the confrontation between Moses and Homer, considered the main representatives of the two cultures. Since greater antiquity implies greater authority, demonstrating the greater antiquity of Moses certainly proves the cultural superiorities of the Jewish Christian culture. However, confrontations between other wisdom figures from both cultures, such as the sibyls and the prophets, are not overlooked either. These chronological discussions are developed in sections of a certain size, which sometimes result in actual, albeit brief, exposures of universal histories. Examples of this phenomenon are to be found in some important apologetic works, such as the ones which we are going to consider: Tatian's orations to the Greeks, Theophilus of Antioch to Autolycus, and Clemens of Alexandria's Miscellaneous. It is precisely in these sections that a link between the apologetic literature of the 2nd century and the Christian Universal Chronicles has been identified. According to a now generally accepted view, the chronicle would have developed the chronological reflection initiated by the apologetic tradition. That is, Christian chronicles would have developed the representation of history that had been shaped in apologetic works, integrating it with the legacies of the Judeo-Hellenistic apologetic tradition and the Hellenistic Roman universal historiography. From these chronological debates, the chronicles would have drawn some important synchronies on which they would have based their stories, such as the one between Moses and Inachus, first king of Argos, the synchronies proving that Moses is earlier than Homer. Before we begin our analysis, we should make one last point. Although the chronological debate we have just described is picked up by apologetics of later centuries, we will not consider apologetic works dating from later than the 2nd, early 3rd century. Such decision has to do with the way in which chronicles are written. Chronicles, in fact, are not normally written from scratch, while they are compiled by copying and combining large sections of previous chronicles. Thus, if we find in the 5th or 6th century chronicles apologetic material or even quotations from apologetic works of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, it is likely that the chronographers drew both the material and the quotations from earlier chronicles, and that they neither directly consulted the cited apologetic works nor felt the need to refer to apologetic literature of their own day. But let us finally get into the substance of our research. As we read the chronological sections of the above-mentioned apologetic works and compare them with the main lateantique chronicles, we seem to find significant correspondences between the myths mentioned in the apologies and those present in the chronicles. Our attention was caught by some groups of characters named jointly only in the apologetic works and in the universal chronicles, such as, with slight variations, Prometheus, Epimetheus, Atlas, Argus, Deucalion, Io, and Cecrops, in apologetic works and in chronicles. This observation led us to suppose that not only synchronies have been drawn from apologetics by chronographers. The apologetic tradition would instead have been also the channel through which the Greek myth would have flown into universal chronicles. The apologetic tradition thus would have been the filter through which the pagan myths were selected and became part of Christian universal history. Along with the case of Prometheus that we have just mentioned, we have decided to present another example of mythical contents flowing from apologetics to chronicle. This case study will also allow us to appreciate how the same material is differently integrated in the chronicles. So I give the floor to Agnese, who will illustrate it.
Thank you. So, as did Prometheus, Epimetheus, and their companions, also Perseus and Dionysus are mentioned together in the chronological accounts of Tatian and Clement's works. Such a combination of characters apparently has a mythical origin that can be traced, for instance, in Pausanias' Periegesis. In Book 2, while describing Argive myths and monuments, Pausanias relates that the god, having made war on Perseus, afterwards laid aside his enmity and received great honors at the hand of the Argives. In the works of Tatian and Clement, Perseus and Dionysus are placed at the time of the king of Argos, Acrisius, who is Perseus' grandfather. Thus, a tradition attesting a connection between Perseus and Dionysus is employed, together with Perseus' family ties, to anchor both mythical characters to history, that is, to the historical Argive king list. The chronicles seem to have borrowed or preserved the couple of Perseus and Dionysus, however, dealing with it differently, depending on the overall structure of each work. Eusebius' canons, for instance, are structured in an analytic way, as you see here, through the juxtaposition of king lists. A variety of information, such as myths, foundations, and so on, is connected to such timeline, forming here in the middle the so-called statium historicum of the canons. In this context, mythical material is present both in the shape of very brief information and of more extensive but still contained narrations. In the canons, Perseus and Dionysus are mentioned in 4 different passages. Dionysus is the blue one and Perseus the red one. On page 48 of Helm's edition, Semele and Danae, mothers of Dionysus and Perseus respectively, are placed between the reign of Danaus and Lynceus in Argos. The birth of Dionysus from Semele and the exploit of Perseus are then dated at the end of the reign of Lynceus, successor of Danaus. On page 52, Perseus' victory over the Gorgon is placed at the end of the reign of Proetus, successor of Lynceus, and Dionysus' victory over the Indians and his foundation of the city are placed in the 14th year of the reign of Acrisius. Finally, we find the killing of Acrisius by Perseus. The latter subsequently departed from Argos, together with the exploits of Dionysus, and his death in battle against Perseus in the 9th year of Eurystheus' reign on Mycenae. So, consistent with the analytic structure of Eusebius' history is the fact that the stories of Dionysus and Perseus are spread over a certain period of time. However, chronological precision does not prevent from maintaining the traditional juxtaposition of the 2 characters whose stories are outlined in parallel. The chronology of the 2 characters proposed by the apologetic tradition is also preserved in the chronicle, where the synchronism with Acrisius, however, only concerns the final part of the stories of Perseus and Dionysus. Another element worth emphasizing is, is the character of the 2 largest sections listed here, dedicated to Perseus' victory over the Gorgon and to Dionysus' deeds and death and burial. In these sections, rationalized versions of the traditional myths are narrated, from which divine and magical elements are removed, thus making traditional tales acceptable as history even to a Christian audience. The Gorgon, for instance, here is presented as a meretrix whose beauty so astonishes those who look at her that they seem petrified. Dionysus is presented as mortal, so much so that his tomb can be seen at Delphi. We can now move to the Excarta Latina Barbari, whose first section is structured differently from Eusebius' canons. And its narrative is mainly focused on biblical history, whose generations and leaders are synthetically enumerated, only occasionally dwelling on some remarkable events. Synchronisms with events, cultural personalities, or rulers of other peoples are sometimes inserted in this main narrative line. For the most part, however, they are limited to meager list of names, as is the case here, where at the time of the judge Gideon, the following characters are placed: Zito and Amphion, Ganymede, Perseus, and Dionysus again together. We get finally to the Chronicle of John Malales, which is an idiosyncratic chronicle in a way, as the narrative concern apparently overcomes the chronological one. The narrative is organized on a system of a very few absolute dates. And to the mention of kings or personalities, be they biblical or mythical, long narratives about their stories, their deeds, and their households are often attached. In this context, the stories of Perseus and Dionysus are extensively related in Book 2 as part of the stories of Zeus' descendants. The story of Perseus from his birth to his death covers about 4 pages in the printed edition and has some features in common with Eusebius' account, that is, magical and divine elements of the myth are reduced to a human dimension. But there is a further development in Malala's narrative that deserves to be emphasized. That is, the story of Perseus is used to create a link between the hero and Syria, the author's homeland. The story of Dionysus, which is similarly detailed and rationalized, follows the story of Perseus by a few chapters after an introduction to Theban history. So with respect to the apologetic couple, Perseus and Dionysus, both the chronological and the mythical connection between the characters is lost in Malala's. A relationship between them is, however, preserved, apparently reduced to a means for organized narrative sequences. So after this overview, what can we say about the relationship between the mythical material present in chronicles and that mentioned in apologetics? So first, in the chronicles, we have observed some of the same juxtapositions of mythical characters as we found in apologetics. The same contents, however, are handled differently depending on the nature of each chronicle. In general, it can be said that myth acquires different purposes while flowing from apologetic to chronicles. Mythical characters and their chronology are no longer important for their role in proving the greater antiquity of the Jewish Christian sages with respect to the Greek heroes and gods. The inclusion of myth seems intended instead to put flesh, so to speak, on the skeleton represented by the historical king lists. Myth is progressively turned into history by means of rationalization and by creating ties to the present. But a final and for us disturbing remark remains to be made. We have noticed, in fact, that mythological material in the chronicles is wider than that conveyed by the apologetics. This statement applies to both the narrative extension, as we just saw, and to the number of the mentioned myths. This is particularly visible in Eusebius, but myths not present in the historical sections of the Apologies can be found also in Malala's and in the Excerpta Barbari. This last remark seems to question our initial hypothesis that the myths we find in chronicles are entirely derived from apologetics. However, the fact that we noted at the outset remains, that is, that certain groups of mythical figures are mentioned jointly and in the same order only in apologetics and chronicles. So what conclusions can we draw from the combination of these two data? We think that 2 hypotheses can be made. First, chronicles could have integrated the material drawn from the apologetic literature with other material drawn from other sources. Or the chronicles and the apologetic literature could have independently derived their mythological material from a common source or from common sources. The former hypothesis may perhaps be preferred to the latter, as we know with some certainty that chronicles took from apologetic the essential synchronisms between Greek myth and biblical history, as we said above. The chronicles would therefore have drawn such synchronisms from apologists, while they would have derived some other myths, as well as the mythical narratives, also from other sources. Is it possible to identify such sources? This is a difficult task. Even when apologists and chronographers mention their sources, in fact, this raises further questions rather than providing answers due to the amount of ancient literature we have lost. However, it would not seem impossible to assume that some of the information about Greek myth was originally contained in the king lists. Such king lists, tracing back as far as the 6th or 5th century BC, at least for the Greek cities, are progressively incorporated into historical and then chronographical works. And they were a means by which events from the pre-Olympic era could be placed in history. That is, mythical figure or episodes were attached to single entries of such king lists, thus receiving a more or less precise and shared placement in time. So such lists could have been a common source to apologetic in chronicles, giving explanation for both the textual coincidences and for the mythical material found in chronicles, but not in apologetics. Unfortunately, such hypothesis is difficult to verify because these lists have reached us only through the chronographic tradition. But we are approaching the end of our paper, and I give the floor back to Marco for the conclusions.
Summarizing the results reached so far, we can conclude that although apologetics must be recognized as the source of the main synchronism between biblical material and pagan myths, apologetic works are not necessarily the direct source for the mythological material in the chronicles. Given the greater extent and number of myths mentioned in the chronicles, it is safer to assume the existence of common sources, even in the face of stronger coincidences in content. While seeking to illuminate the streams of mythology that flow between apology and chronicle, we have run into a further unknown factor, opening the way for new research. As a conclusion for our paper, we therefore propose a slightly modified version of its title, which gives room to this new piece in the puzzle of the history of our text.
Thank you.